kind of unusual lesson today. Um, and it's funny how the Lord does things sometimes, because the way this came about, He impressed something on me, and I knew that I was going to teach, and I knew it was probably going to be this Sunday. And I will say we're going to continue the Unity series, but we will probably break it up and do some other lessons in the middle of it. But I know we've talked about this a lot in class, and I feel like it's just because it keeps coming up. This past year for our entire church family, and I feel like even beyond our church family, has been difficult. There's been loss, lots of, I feel like an abundance of sickness, more than normal. And I told somebody this past week, I said, we thought 2020 was hard, and now I'm like, 2020 was a walk in the park. This year has been difficult. Um, and and so I was, it seems like every time I'm like, okay, I think we're getting through one thing, something else happens. And then, of course, my dad's episode that started a couple weeks ago happened. Um, and I remember she called me that day and said, hey, I want to let you know what's going on. And my immediate reaction was, okay, I'm going to find somebody to take care of the things I'm supposed to be taking care of, and I'm on my way. And she, being a pastor's wife, said, no, ma'am, he'll be okay. You can't do anything about it. You stay there. You have things to take care of. And so that Sunday night, when we were getting ready to go on the platform to sing, and I had gone down to get something from my pew, and my brother-in-law stopped me and said, hey, is your dad okay? And I nearly lost it. He knows me. We've known each other since we were kids. I said, Donald, I'm not normally someone who loses control of their feelings, but I'm struggling right now, and I have to go on the platform and smile and worship and seem like everything's okay. But it's my dad, and it, like, that was the first time it hit really, really close to home. And then there has been, and then our former pastor passed away, and there were lots of emotions associated with that. Of course, everybody in here has the stresses of being a parent or being a spouse, or all of the different things you're involved in, work. We're all juggling all of these roles, and then we're not even bringing into play politics. We're in an election season, world events. It's literally like everywhere you turn, there's something. And I'm making sure this is turned on okay. And so I think it was last Tuesday, or maybe, no, I think it was the Tuesday before last. I am just having a day where it's like, I feel like I'm drowning. Like, I can't possibly process anything else. And we came to church, and I poured my heart out in the prayer room. And then we had a really good service. And, a lot of times on Tuesday it's teaching, and I'll be the first to say I love teaching, because y'all know I'm a nerd and I love Bible study. And so, but this was more preaching. There was an altar call. Again, I'm like pouring my heart out, and I get back in the car to go home, and I feel like there's just still not a sense of like relief. A lot of times you leave from prayer and you feel like the weight's been lifted. And I got in my car. I happened that night to be driving by myself, and I got in the turning lane to turn left onto the street where I live. And I said, Lord, I know your word says that when my heart is overwhelmed, lead me to the rock. But I'm like talking to the Lord. I'm like, but I'm going to be really honest with you. Like, I've heard that my whole life. We sing, when my heart gets overwhelmed, lead me to the rock. My whole life we sang that. And I would always feel like, okay, well, I know the word says the rock is Christ Jesus. I know I need to be led to him. But lead me to the rock that's higher than I. It just never, it wasn't one of those things that I read and felt like, I understand it. It was more like, this is something I recite, but I don't really grasp it. And I'm in the car and I'm telling the Lord this. I'm like, I'm asking you because I'm overwhelmed, and apparently your word says, when my heart is overwhelmed, lead me to the rock. So I'm praying it and I'm talking to you, but I don't know that I understand what that means. And I'm like, why did it take me 44 years to ask him? But I'm like, God, what does it really mean? And I immediately imagined this cliff. And I imagined him leading a little lamb up the cliff, leading a person up the cliff. And this rocky cliff that comes to a point, and down below is a valley. And he said, well, the top of the rock, there's perspective. I see, I can get to the highest point. And so I've taught this in this class, that his perspective is bigger than ours, that he sees everything where we only see. But when we're in the middle of it, when we're overwhelmed, we feel like we are at the lowest point and we can't see the forest for the trees. Everything is right in front of our face. And he's saying, you're asking me to lead you to a vantage point where you can get perspective on everything you're going through. And so this week, and I could, I like, as I was writing my notes, I wrote a list of things that was overwhelming, even longer. But my point is, I'm not coming in here to try to make you all feel just as overwhelmed. But because I suddenly felt like he was giving me understanding, I thought, okay, it's time for me to study this. And I knew he was giving me a revelation for a reason. And I thought about the properties of rocks. They're immovable. We're not talking, when it says lead me to the rock that's higher than that, we're not talking about a rock I can pick up in my hand. We're talking about a cliff. We're talking about a shelter, a cave, something that's not moving, something that I can hide in, or something that I can stand on, higher perspective and understanding. And so I did a word search in my online study Bible for rock, and there was some things. And then I thought, rock that is higher than I. So I did a search for higher, and I found something really interesting. There were 3 topics that stood out and that kept coming up: the Tower of Babel, high places, and the specific mention of eastward. And I know right now that's going to seem kind of random, but we're going to explore these topics a little bit, and I want you to kind of bear with me. It's going to be a little bit more like a Bible study, but next week I'm going to explain. And I think some of you are going to start picking it up before then, but we'll get into more of the good part of it. So most of you are probably familiar with the Tower of Babel. We'll say that again. The descendants of Noah were the group of people that had come to build the Tower of Babel. And when Noah and his family left the ark, God gave a commandment that they be fruitful and multiply. And there was an implication in there of spreading out and filling the earth, because everything had been wiped out. And so rather than obeying God's command to fill the earth and spread out as God had ordered, the Bible says they settled in the land of Shinar, I can't seem to get this right, a fertile land watered by the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. And immediately when I read that and it said that they settled, the word settled jumped out at me, because growth is work. Moving toward a future is work. Sometimes it's difficult. And so sometimes we settle for the comfort of here and now. And I think it was like, well, hey, this is a good place. There's water. It's lush. We can grow plants here. This seems like a really great place. We have all our family together. Why would we spread out? Why would we move on? And so once they'd reached this plain, they start this massive building project. And I think it's interesting because I think when we settle, it's easy to get caught up in a distraction rather than continuing to seek God's will and seek where he's bringing us and work toward it. So the city was built in defiance of God's commandment. And the building of the city would establish a unified front against God by preventing the scattering. And so the building also, I've talked about this in previous lessons, the building was made using waterproof materials, and they're aiming high above the level of the flood. So here they've come out of the flood. The very next thing we read is that they settle in this plain, and they're like, we're going to build a waterproof tower, and we're going to make sure it's tall enough that the next time there's a flood, we're going to be safe. But here's the thing. Now they'd been disobedient to the call of God, and they were looking for comfort over commission. They were also trying to make a name. The reference materials say that they were trying to make a name for themselves rather than glorifying God. And some say the builders, who were the descendants of Shem, and the Hebrew, Shem was one of the sons of Noah, and the Hebrew root means name or fame. So they wanted to create a name or fame for themselves, but the Bible or the reference materials say instead of being Shem, they became a sham because they sought their own fame, their own name, instead of seeking God's fulfillment of his plan. And so in the end, God's plan is still fulfilled because they end up scattered, as we all know. And the name of the city and their legacy would be Babel. And the meaning of Babel is confusion. So instead of creating what they thought they were going to create, all they really did was create confusion. And so this instance of them trying to make a name for themselves and God saying, look, my purpose is going to be done one way or another. So here, let me confuse the language and you're going to scatter anyway. They didn't create the kind of name they wanted to create. And then immediately afterward, we find a contrast where where the account of Abraham, God himself gives Abraham a name, figuratively and literally, because he says, you're not going to be Abram, you're going to be Abraham. And he said, and you're going to have a legacy that's going to live on, because Abraham had a heart toward God and he operated in faith. And he was willing. When God said move, he moved. When God said sacrifice, he sacrificed. And so these are kind of compared in the Old Testament. And it's a comparison of like, what are you going to do? Are you going to obey? So why would they want to build this tower? Well, protection from the flood, like we talked about. But here's the thing. The flood was, first of all, a direct consequence of sin in the earth. And God, in Genesis 8:21 through 22, he says, the word says, and the Lord was pleased with the aroma of the sacrifice and said to himself, I will never again curse the ground because of the human race, even though everything they think or imagine is bent toward evil from childhood. I'll never again destroy all living things. As long as the earth remains, there will be planting and harvest, cold and heat, summer, winter, day and night. And then going on in 9:11, it says, yes, I'm confirming my covenant with you. Never again will floodwaters kill all living creatures. Never again will a flood destroy the earth. So God literally has given his word. I don't care what you do, I'm not going to flood the earth again. He says, I know you're bent toward evil, and I know we're probably going to go through this again, but I give you my word, I won't flood the earth. And yet, in spite of that, rather than trusting God at his word, it's tempting as humans to lean into our own logic or what we see with our eyes. So faith is knowing, not only believing, but knowing what God's word is and believing it will come to pass. But rather than sowing according to what they wanted to reap, so rather than saying, hey, sin brought the flood upon us, and on one hand, God's telling us that he'll never flood us again, but at the same time, we need to reap better if we're going to sow, or we need to sow better if we're going to reap better. So rather than being obedient, what we see is that they're like, let's find a way to circumvent this just in case he doesn't keep his word. And just in case we decide to do whatever we want, let's find a way around it. Let's make sure that we're protected. And we see throughout Scripture that God won't stand for willful disobedience. He's very patient and kind when it comes to human nature. Hebrews 10:26 through 27 says, dear friends, if we deliberately continue sinning after we've received knowledge of the truth, there's no longer any sacrifice that will cover these sins. There's only the terrible expectation of God's judgment and the raging fire that will consume his enemies. The terrible expectation. I think there was something in them that said, we're not really, even after all of this, we're not really willing to do what he's asking. And so he might say there's not going to be a flood, but last time there was a flood, so we better protect ourselves. Now, on the other hand, Romans 3:23 says, for all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. God's grace is sufficient when we're weak, when we're human, when we fall just because out of our own weakness. But there's definitely a precedent that when it's that willful, I'm going to do what I want, there are going to be consequences. And I think in parenting, we made a decision long ago, and we felt like this was modeled in the Word, that with our kids, if they're doing something that is age appropriate behavior, if Judah climbs on a chair or rolls around on the floor, he knocks something over, I'm going to try to redirect him. I'm going to say, hey, bud, that's not a good idea. We're at church. Let's get down. But there's not going to be punishment because it's age appropriate behavior. And I'm trying to teach him what is and isn't appropriate. On the other hand, if I say, hey, grab your backpack, we're headed out, and he looks at me and says, I'm not going to do it, there is going to be a much firmer hand. There's going to be a consequence because, again, I'm trying to curb that spirit of I'm going to do what I want to do because I know God won't stand for it. So the other reason that we suspect that they might have built this tower, ancients had a belief that heaven was directly above them, but directly above earth. And so if they could build a tower high enough, they could actually reach physically into the presence of God. They could establish their own importance in the sight of God and humankind. And the heights represented accomplishment and wisdom and understanding and human ability and ingenuity. We can do it ourselves. And we see that again today, like humanism. We can do it ourselves. You have all the power you need within you. And God, that goes directly against what God's designed. And then the last thing is they wanted to prevent a scattering. They wanted to build a name for themselves, and that was higher priority than being fruitful and multiplying. And they wanted to build a monument to their own greatness, to their own accomplishment. And then the monument was going to be a power center to their fame, to their glory, to their ambition. And they were going to create this united government that would rule over all in defiance of the commandment of God. And I think it's interesting, all of this, to note that Babel is the original origin of Babylon. That's where Babylon got started. And we look at Babylon today, and it's a type of the world, and it's sin, living in sin. And so as I was researching all of this, and I'm thinking, this is really interesting. Like it's such a short story in the Old Testament, yet there's so much in it. There's so much in it that's applicable to what we deal with today. It made me think, okay, the whole point was they were trying to get high. And I started thinking about the mention of high places in the Old Testament. And of course, they came up in my search as well. And I thought, okay, I wonder if there's any correlation here because I've never seen like any direct connection there. And I think in my mind, I always thought when I heard mention of high places that it was only negative. Because we hear in these other references, it's literally like when you get into First, Second Kings and First and Second Chronicles, it seems like every chapter you read, nevertheless, the high places were not taken away. But the high places were not taken away. Howbeit, the high places were not taken away. It's like a refrain. Every king that would come along, they would build these high places. And they were a substitute for worship and sacrifice, and worship. I mean, worship, sacrifice, and I'm getting ahead of myself, and I can't get to the right place in my notes. But it was a substitute again for God's plan. We're good enough to do this on our own. We don't have to do it the way He says. And so Jeremiah 19:5 says, "They have built also the high places of Baal to burn their sons with fire, or for burnt offerings unto Baal, which I commanded not, nor spake it, neither came into my mind." And immediately that made me think of abortion. I know that it's compared a lot of times to the sacrifices that were made unto Baal. And a while back, there was this thing on social media and media in general that became popular, that all of these celebrities and individuals were coming out with abortion testimonials. I don't know if anybody's familiar with this, but it was like, I'm gonna like not brag, but admit that I had an abortion, and here was my reasoning. I had a career, or I wanted to do this, or I wanted to do that, and so I chose to have an abortion. And they were like glorifying abortion and saying, "Hey, sometimes you got to make a sacrifice." And we're twisting what God intended. Yes, He intended for us to make a sacrifice, and yes, He intended for us to put things on the altar. But again, it's like we're convoluting what God intended. The world will tell you to put your own ambitions above everything, even above your family's well-being, and putting God's mission at the center and putting God's plan at the center is very countercultural. Ephesians 6:12 says, "For we wrestle not against the flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of darkness of this world, against spiritual wickedness in high places." So another negative mention of high places. Numbers 33:52. "Then ye shall drive out all the inhabitants of the land before you, and destroy all their pictures, and destroy all their molten images, and quite pluck down all their high places." And I thought pictures was an odd word, and I looked it up, and it comes from Hebrew maskith, which is a figure carved in stone or on a wall or an object, or it can be an imagination or a conceit or an image. And so he's telling them, like, tear down these ideas of sinful ideas of what worship should be. Ezekiel 16:39, "And I will also give thee into their hand, and they shall throw down thine eminent place, and shall break down thy high places. They shall strip thee also of thy clothes, and shall take thy fair jewels, and leave thee naked and bare." The prophet's warning here was to Israel, that because of her selling herself out to these false gods and idols, there were going to be grave consequences. He was comparing Israel's chasing after, again, these sinful ideas of what worship and sacrifice were to be. And he's telling them that you're basically like a prostitute. You're selling yourself to sinful ideas and to these false gods. The world's going to tell you that you can have what you want, that you can get fulfillment, that you can reap what you desire in God without fulfilling his rules and requirements. And they're going to offer up these little gods that promise all the benefits without the cost. At least that's what they want you to believe. Jeremiah 3:21, "A voice was heard upon the high places, weeping and supplications of the children of Israel, for they have perverted their way, they have forgotten the Lord their God." He's saying, you've got it all confused. The high places were a perversion of prayer, sacrifice, and worship. So, and then, as I said earlier, we see this cycle of straying and returning to God's law. But even in the return, there's this refrain of forsaking, tearing down the high places. So I'm researching through all of that, and I'm gathering a greater understanding of what the high places really were, and how it wasn't just, I think I always imagined high places, I don't know, I guess because there's a lot of mention of like trees and hillsides of this, place where, and I think the evangelist that was here recently talked about this, that they would even like carve gods into trees. And so I picture, again, up on a hillside, these areas that they've designated, but I'd never really grasped that it was a what's the word I'm looking for? I'm going to go back to my notes. It was a perversion of God's plan. And that's what the enemy will do. He'll take God's word, even he'll take what God tells us to do, and he'll just say, "Okay, but we can do it our way. Like, let's do it this way." But because of that, it can make an individual feel like, "Well, I'm worshiping, I'm sacrificing." But God says, if you don't do it my way, it doesn't matter. But as I researched all of this, I found out that there were actually positive mentions of high places, and so I'm going to go through those really quickly, or as quickly as I can. Habakkuk 3:19, "The Lord God is my strength, and he will make my feet like hinds' feet, and he will make me to walk upon mine high places." And here he's not talking about a negative one. Amos 4:13, "For lo, he that formeth the mountains, and createth the wind, and declareth unto man what is his thought, that maketh the morning darkness, and treadeth upon the high places of earth, the Lord, the God of hosts, is his name." Isaiah 58:14, "Then shalt thou delight thyself in the Lord, and I will cause thee to ride upon the high places of the earth, and feed thee with the heritage of Jacob thy father, for the mouth of the Lord hath spoken it." Isaiah 41:18, "I will open rivers in high places, and fountains in the midst of the valleys. I will make the wilderness a pool of water, and the dry land springs of water." It sounds like refreshing. It sounds like strength. 1 Samuel 13:6, "When the men of Israel saw that they were in a strait, for the people were distressed, Then the people did hide themselves in caves and in thickets and in rocks and in high places and in pits. 2 Samuel 22:34. He maketh my feet like hinds' feet, and setteth me upon my high places. 1 Kings 3:3. And Solomon loved the Lord, walking in the statutes of David his father, only he sacrificed and burnt incense in high places. This one's not positive in the sense that he's doing what we've talked about. He was using high places. But the reason I'm bringing it out is because we're human and things are not always real black and white. So when Solomon started out, and when we start out, or sometimes when we've reset and we're turning ourselves back toward God, there are inevitably going to be blessings. When Solomon had the right heart and he sought wisdom, God blessed him abundantly. And that wisdom was fruitful not only spiritually, but in the physical. He became very wealthy and very influential. But I think Solomon got caught up in his own wisdom and in all those things that it did for him. And so we have to differentiate between godly wisdom and worldly wisdom, and in how we utilize those things that he's given us, the blessings of God, because perversion often starts with the mixing of the truly spiritual and the worldly wisdom. So as I'm going through all of these negative and positive aspects of high places, and I'm reading through commentaries, the mention of eastward keeps coming up, and it keeps expressing that there's a significance of eastward. And at first it might seem like, well, what does that have to do with the other two? But I think you'll see where I'm headed. The book of Genesis emphasizes that as a man moves eastward, he moves away from God. We see this in the Garden of Eden, the flood of Noah, and now in the Tower of Babel. It would also be seen later in Genesis when Lot separated from Abraham and went to Sodom. When humankind leaves the area of blessing, he goes to places that cause him problems. And so I found this article, and the person who wrote it does a better job of explaining it than I would. And so I just would like to read this to you, or an excerpt from it. He says, see, the Bible has a weird relationship with the East. Not a specific country or political entity, just the direction. For instance, the tabernacle and the temple both faced to the east. So I guess when you entered them, you walked westwards. Keep this in mind. The wise men saw a star in the east and traveled from the east to find the infant Jesus. The Messiah, when he arrived, was meant to come from the east, specifically the Mount of Olives, which is to the east of Jerusalem. The east is the source of blessings and divine salvation, which is cool. But wait, people who traveled to the east found themselves either in trouble or causing trouble. Cain was exiled to the east after killing Abel. People traveled east to build the Tower of Babel. When Abraham and Lot decided to go their separate ways, Lot went east and ended up in Sodom and Gomorrah. The Israelites were exiled to Babylon in the east. There's a tension here, almost a paradox. Good things come from the east, but if you travel to the east, you end up in a bad place. What's going on here? Here's what I mean. If you write down in line and in order the following years, and he puts them randomly: 1945, 1066, 1914, 1966, and 1666. If we're told to write these on a line from oldest to newest, what direction do we write them? From left to right, right? We start over here on the left side, which is from, let's see, that's north, so that's from west to east. He says, now my list goes in ascending order from left to right. That's because I'm English. I speak English, I think in English, and I write in English. And as English is written from left to right, I perceive time is moving in that direction too. Left to right, west to east. Okay, but Hebrew is written from right to left. And lo and behold, that's how time progresses in Jewish thought. Right to left, west to east. And there's even a scientific article on this, how Americans think that way, but it's not necessarily everybody in the world that thinks the way we do. See, it's not that good places were in the West and bad places in the East. It's all about the direction traveled. But the direction y'all, I can't make that word come out. But the direction traveled temporally or mentally and emotionally, not physically, is what we're talking about here. You face east to see the past and the present, the realms of memory and experience. You look east to what's gone before to see God coming. But when you see him, he's traveling towards you. And if you want to stick with him, you've got to move yourself, travel towards the west, towards a future with God. If instead you move to the east, you're moving away from God to a place that God's already left. And it may be an attractive place or an exciting place, but God's not there anymore. And sooner or later, you're going to find yourself in trouble. You're living apart from God's blessings, away from his ongoing work. So traveling to the west is maybe symbolic of moving into the future, into the direction of God's ongoing story. It's a dynamic thing. Travel to the east, however, is traveling into exile, into captivity, less dynamic and more static, away from God's salvation. Moving east is a bad idea because it's moving away from a God. And he says, it's a theory anyway. However, it works. It's an important lesson. Even seemingly unimportant details can teach us something. The geography of the Bible is practical, sure, but it's also full of symbolic value where rocks, trees, and points of the compass have layers of meaning informed by language and history and divine revelation. Abraham and Moses and Peter and Jesus walked through a theological landscape, a landscape we can learn from. So look to the east, you never know what you'll see. His point is, if we're moving to the past, if we're moving to what he's already done, if we're moving to comfort, if we're settling, we're missing God's will. We always have to be moving forward. We've got to go the direction he's headed. He's moving and we have to move with him. We have to move toward a future in God. And the word makes it very clear that looking back is not always productive. I don't want to be Lot's wife who looked back to what seemed safe and secure and comfortable, afraid to leave what's behind because I don't know what the future is that God's calling me to. And next week, we'll get into what that